The silk of my emerald gown whispered against my legs as I climbed the marble steps of the Metropolitan Opera House, each step echoing like a countdown to my own execution. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the delicate beading along my neckline, a nervous habit I'd developed since David left me 3 years ago. The weight of every gaze felt like daggers piercing through the carefully constructed armor of my confidence. I had spent 2 hours perfecting my makeup, another hour selecting the perfect dress from my dwindling collection of gowns that still fit properly, and countless minutes in front of the mirror practicing the smile I would need to survive tonight. The annual Children's Hospital Gala, an event I once attended as David's wife, floating through conversations about charity donations and summer homes in the Hamptons. Now I was here alone, a statement I wasn't entirely sure I was brave enough to make. The cool October air carried the scent of expensive perfumes and the distant sound of a string quartet warming up inside. My breath formed small clouds in the crisp evening, and I pulled my vintage fur wrap closer around my shoulders. It had been my grandmother's, one of the few precious things David hadn't managed to claim in our divorce. The familiar weight of it against my skin provided a small comfort, a reminder of who I was before I became Mrs. David Wellington. Brooke? Brooke Bennett? I turned to see Margaret Ashworth, wife of the city's most prominent judge, her eyes wide with what could have been surprise or pity. In our old social circle, the two emotions often looked remarkably similar. Margaret, I replied, forcing warmth into my voice. How lovely to see you. Her gaze swept over me, taking in my solitary state with the precision of a hawk spotting wounded prey. I had no idea you'd be here tonight. David mentioned you were. Well, that you were keeping a low profile these days. The implication hung in the air between us like smoke. Keeping a low profile was Margaret's delicate way of saying, fallen from grace, without actually having to acknowledge the spectacular nature of my fall. 3 years ago, I had been the wife of one of the city's most successful investment bankers, a former principal dancer with the Metropolitan Ballet Company, someone whose opinion mattered at gatherings like this. Now I was a curiosity, a cautionary tale whispered about in powder rooms and private dining clubs. I've been focusing on my work, I said, which was partially true. The small dance studio I'd opened in Brooklyn barely paid my rent, but it was mine. Every morning I unlocked those doors. I was reminded that I had survived David's attempts to control every aspect of my life, including my career. How? Industrious of you? Margaret's smile could have cut glass. I suppose we all must adapt to our circumstances. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't result in my immediate ejection from the premises, Margaret's attention shifted to something behind me. Her expression transformed from condescending sympathy to genuine shock, her perfectly lipsticked mouth forming a small O of surprise. I followed her gaze and felt my own breath catch in my throat. David was ascending the steps with his new wife, Clarissa, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light from the ornate chandeliers visible through the opera house's glass doors. She was everything I had once been, young, blonde, graceful, and utterly devoted to playing the role of perfect society wife. At 24, she was 8 years younger than me, a detail David had made sure everyone knew during our very public divorce proceedings. But it wasn't the sight of David that made my heart race with a mixture of panic and rage. It was the satisfied smirk on his face as his eyes found mine, the subtle way he straightened his shoulders and placed his hand possessively on Clarissa's lower back. He had dressed for this moment, chosen his entrance time carefully, orchestrated this encounter with the precision of a military operation. Brooke, his voice carried across the space between us, smooth as aged whiskey and just as likely to burn. What a surprise to see you here. The conversations around us seemed to dim, though I was sure it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Margaret stepped subtly away from my side, distancing herself from what was clearly about to become a spectacle. In our world, being associated with drama was almost as damaging as being the source of it. David, I managed, proud that my voice remained steady. Clarissa, you both look lovely. Clarissa beamed at the compliment, clearly oblivious to the undercurrents of tension crackling between her husband and his ex-wife. She was wearing a blush-pink Valentino that probably cost more than my studio's monthly rent, and her engagement ring, my engagement ring, I realized with a jolt, sparkled under the lights. We're so excited about tonight's performances, Clarissa gushed, her voice carrying the breathless enthusiasm of someone who had never experienced a significant disappointment. David says you used to dance professionally? That must have been so fulfilling before you. Well, before you moved on to other things. The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Before I moved on to other things. As if my career had been a hobby I'd simply grown tired of, rather than something David had systematically destroyed through a campaign of emotional manipulation and financial control. I still dance, I said quietly, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I teach now. I own a studio in Brooklyn. David's laugh was soft, but it carried the cruel edge I remembered from our worst fights. A studio in Brooklyn. How quaint. I suppose we all have to start somewhere when we're rebuilding. The implication was clear to everyone within earshot. I wasn't rebuilding. I was settling for less than I deserved, because I was less than I had been. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire. Heads turned in our direction, some with curiosity, others with the barely concealed excitement of witnessing social carnage. Teaching children to pirouette in a converted warehouse, David continued, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure his words reached the maximum number of ears. It's admirable, really, how you've embraced such a modest lifestyle. My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. This was what he wanted, to see me crumble, to confirm for everyone present that I was exactly as broken as he'd claimed I was during our divorce. The successful, independent woman I'd tried to become over the past 3 years felt as fragile as spun glass under his calculating gaze. At least I'm doing something I love, I replied, hating how defensive I sounded. Of course, David's smile was all teeth, though I can't help but wonder if you ever think about what you gave up. Principal dancer with the Met, a real career, a real life, such a waste of talent. The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Every insecurity I'd battled over the past 3 years, every moment of doubt about whether I'd made the right choice in leaving him, every fear that I was nothing without the platform he'd provided. It all came rushing back with devastating clarity. Clarissa looked between us with growing discomfort, finally sensing the undercurrents she'd been oblivious to moments before. Perhaps we should find our table, she suggested softly, her hand tightening on David's arm. But David wasn't finished. He never was when he had an audience and a target who couldn't escape. You know, Brooke, if you ever need anything at all, you shouldn't hesitate to ask. I know how difficult it must be, trying to make ends meet with that little hobby of yours. The offer of help was delivered with such false magnanimity that several people nearby actually gasped. It was a masterpiece of public humiliation disguised as generosity, and everyone present understood the subtext perfectly. David Wellington was offering charity to his fallen ex-wife, publicly acknowledging how far I had sunk while positioning himself as the benevolent victor. My vision blurred slightly around the edges, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that preceded a panic attack. The walls of the opera house seemed to be closing in, the whispered conversations growing louder, more judgmental. I needed to escape, to find somewhere private where I could fall apart without providing any more entertainment for David and his audience. I was about to excuse myself, to flee with whatever dignity I had left, when I felt a presence behind me. Not close enough to be improper, but near enough that I could sense someone's approach. The conversations around us didn't just dim this time. They stopped entirely, as if someone had thrown a switch and muted the entire gathering. "Dance with me." The voice was low, rough around the edges like aged bourbon, and it sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, afraid that my humiliation had finally driven me to hallucination. But the man standing behind me was very real and unlike anyone I'd ever seen at one of these events. He was tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and shoulders that strained against his perfectly tailored black tuxedo. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, steel gray and intense, focused on me with an attention that felt almost predatory in its completeness. This wasn't the polite social attention I was accustomed to from men at these gatherings. This was something else entirely. "I beg your pardon?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile was slight, more of a quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his entire face from intimidating to something approaching approachable. "You heard me correctly. Dance with me." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a statement of fact delivered with the kind of quiet authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Around us, the silence had taken on an almost reverent quality, as if everyone present was holding their breath. I glanced around and realized that every person within a 20-foot radius was staring at us with expressions ranging from shock to fascination to what looked suspiciously like fear. Margaret Ashworth's face had gone completely pale, and David looked like he'd seen a ghost. "I don't believe we've been introduced," I said, trying to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation. His smile widened slightly, revealing perfect white teeth. "Blake Donovan," he said simply, as if that explained everything. The name hit the gathered crowd like a physical force. I heard someone behind me actually gasp, and Margaret took another step backward, her eyes wide with what I now recognized as genuine terror. Even David, who had faced down hostile corporate takeovers and federal investigations with unflappable calm, looked shaken. Blake Donovan. I knew the name, of course. Everyone in the city knew the name, though few had ever seen the man behind it. He was a legend, a ghost story told in boardrooms and private clubs. The man who controlled half the city's construction contracts, whose legitimate businesses were fronts for something much darker and more dangerous. The man who could make problems disappear with a single phone call. And he was asking me to dance. Blake extended his hand toward me, palm up, fingers long and surprisingly elegant for someone with his reputation. I stared at it for a moment that felt like an eternity, aware that everyone around us was watching, waiting to see what I would do. David's face had gone from smug satisfaction to barely concealed panic. And I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I held some form of power in our dynamic. "I don't know how to say no to you, do I?" I murmured, placing my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine with surprising gentleness, and I felt the calluses on his palm. Not the soft hands of a man who spent his days in boardrooms, but evidence of someone who had worked his way up from something much harder than corporate climbing. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of electricity up my arm, and I had to resist the urge to pull away. "Smart woman," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. "Shall we?" The crowd parted before us as he led me toward the entrance of the opera house, conversations resuming in hushed, urgent whispers behind us. I caught fragments of words. "Dangerous. Never seen him at one of these. What is he doing with David Wellington's ex-wife?" But Blake seemed oblivious to the speculation we were generating. The interior of the Metropolitan Opera House always took my breath away, but tonight it seemed especially magnificent. The grand staircase curved upward beneath crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors, and the sound of the string quartet echoed through the soaring space with ethereal beauty. Blake guided me past the clusters of elegantly dressed guests, his hand firm and steady on the small of my back. "You're causing quite a stir," I observed, nodding toward a group of women who were staring at us with undisguised fascination. "Am I?" He glanced around with apparent indifference. I hadn't noticed. It was a lie, of course. A man like Blake Donovan noticed everything, calculated every angle, planned every move with chessmaster precision. His decision to appear tonight, to single me out, to publicly claim my attention, none of it was accidental. We reached the main ballroom, where couples were already moving across the polished floor to a waltz that seemed to have been chosen specifically for our entrance. Blake turned to face me, one hand settling at my waist while the other maintained its grip on my fingers. This close, I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that mixed cedar with hints of smoke and spice. "Why me?" I asked as we began to move together. "Of all the women here tonight, why did you choose to dance with David Wellington's discarded wife?" His eyes never left mine as we swept across the floor, and I was surprised to discover that he was an excellent dancer. His movements were confident and controlled, leading me through the steps with the same quiet authority he'd displayed when he'd first approached me. "Who says you're discarded?" he asked, spinning me out and drawing me back against his chest in one fluid motion. "Maybe you're exactly where you're supposed to be." The cryptic response frustrated me, but before I could press him for clarification, I noticed that we had attracted an audience. The other couples on the dance floor had gradually moved to the perimeter, leaving us alone in the center of the room. Every eye in the ballroom was focused on us, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed fear. "They're all watching us," I whispered, suddenly self-conscious about the spectacle we were creating. "Let them watch." Blake's grip on my waist tightened slightly, pulling me closer. "You're beautiful. You dance like you were born for it, and you're with me. Of course they're watching." The compliment sent warmth spreading through my chest, followed immediately by suspicion. Beautiful women were common at events like this, and accomplished dancers were hardly rare in New York's social circles. There had to be another reason he'd chosen me, something I was missing. "Mr. Donovan." David's voice cut through the music like a blade, and I felt Blake's entire body tense against mine. We stopped dancing, though he kept his arms around me as we turned to face my ex-husband. David had followed us into the ballroom, Clarissa trailing behind him with the expression of confused concern. "Wellington?" Blake's acknowledgement was barely civil, his tone suggesting that David ranked somewhere below week-old garbage in his estimation. "I wasn't aware you knew my ex-wife," David continued, his lawyer's instincts kicking in as he probed for information. "Brooke and I were just catching up on old times." The possessive undertone in David's voice made my skin crawl, but Blake's response was a study in controlled menace. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make any threatening gestures, but somehow he managed to project an aura of barely leashed violence that made several nearby guests take involuntary steps backward. "Were you?" Blake's smile was sharp enough to cut. "How nostalgic, though I believe the lady was looking rather uncomfortable during your conversation." David's face flushed red, but he was smart enough not to push further. Whatever reputation Blake Donovan had built in this city, it was enough to make a man like David, who had never backed down from a fight in his life, think twice about escalating the situation. "Of course," David said stiffly. "I didn't mean to interrupt your dance." "You didn't interrupt anything," Blake replied smoothly. "Brooke and I are just getting started." The double meaning in his words wasn't lost on anyone present, least of all David. My ex-husband's jaw clenched, and I could see him struggling with the urge to assert some kind of claim over me. But whatever power David wielded in corporate boardrooms and country club dining rooms, it was nothing compared to the quiet menace radiating from the man currently holding me in his arms. "Enjoy your evening," David said finally, the words coming out like they tasted bitter. He turned on his heel and stalked away, Clarissa hurrying to keep up with his sudden departure. I began, then realized I didn't have words for what I'd just witnessed. Necessary, Blake finished for me, guiding me back into the dance as the orchestra launched into another waltz. David Wellington has been operating under the impression that he has some kind of ongoing authority over your life. I thought it might be useful to correct that misconception. The casual way he discussed manipulating my ex-husband should have alarmed me, but instead I felt a fierce satisfaction blooming in my chest. For 3 years, David had wielded his social connections and financial resources like weapons, making sure that everyone in our former circle knew exactly how far I had fallen. Tonight, for the first time since our divorce, someone had made him back down. "You don't even know me," I pointed out, though I made no move to leave his embrace. "For all you know, I deserved everything David said about me." Blake's laugh was low and rich, sending another shiver of awareness through me. "I've been watching you for months, Brooke. I know exactly who you are." The admission should have terrified me. Instead, it sent a thrill of something dangerous and intoxicating through my veins. "Watching me?" "Your studio in Brooklyn," he said, as if that explained everything. "I own the building." My feet stumbled slightly, and only Blake's firm grip kept me from missing a step entirely. "You're my landlord?" Among other things. His smile was enigmatic, giving away nothing. "You're an excellent teacher, your students adore you, and you've been struggling to make ends meet because David made sure that none of your former connections would hire you for anything substantial." The casual revelation that he knew about David's campaign to blacklist me from the city's dance community hit me like a physical blow. I had suspected, of course. It was too convenient that every major dance company, theater, and arts organization had suddenly decided they had no need for my services. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that my failure to rebuild my career had been orchestrated rather than earned, made my chest tighten with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the music. "About David's interference?" "Long enough." Blake spun me again, this time using the movement to pull me even closer to his body. "I don't like bullies, Brooke. And I particularly don't like men who use their resources to crush women who had the courage to walk away from them." The protection implicit in his words should have worried me. I had learned the hard way that men who promised to shield me from the world often ended up building cages instead. But there was something different about Blake Donovan, something that suggested his protection came without the suffocating control David had wielded. "What do you want from me?" I asked bluntly, tired of dancing around the obvious questions. His eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Direct. I like that." He guided us toward the edge of the dance floor, where we could speak without being overheard by every gossip columnist and social media influencer in the room. "What makes you think I want anything? Men like you don't do anything without a reason," I replied. "You didn't appear here tonight by accident, and you certainly didn't ask me to dance out of the goodness of your heart. So what's the angle?" Blake studied my face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around us, the ballroom continued to buzz with conversation and speculation, but I felt as if we were enclosed in a bubble of privacy, isolated from the crowd by the sheer force of his presence. "You're right," he said finally. "I do want something from you." My heart rate spiked, and I prepared myself for whatever proposition was coming. Money, influence, information about David's business dealings, all the usual reasons powerful men inserted themselves into the lives of vulnerable women. "I want you to dance again," he said simply. "Really dance. The way you were meant to." Of all the things I had expected him to say, that wasn't even on the list. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "What?" "I'm opening a new venue," Blake continued, his hand still warm against my back. "Upscale, exclusive, the kind of place where New York's elite comes to see and be seen. I want you to choreograph the opening performance." The offer hit me like a lightning bolt, illuminating possibilities I had convinced myself were dead and buried. To choreograph again, to work with professional dancers, to create something beautiful and meaningful. It was everything I had dreamed of during the long, lonely months of teaching basic positions to children who would never perform outside their parents' living rooms. "Why?" I managed, my voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. Blake's smile was softer this time, almost gentle. "Because you're brilliant, and the world deserves to see what you can create when you're not being held back by small men with smaller minds." The music swelled around us, reaching a crescendo that seemed to underscore the magnitude of what he was offering. This wasn't just a job. It was redemption, a chance to reclaim the part of myself that David had tried so hard to destroy. "I'll need complete creative control," I heard myself saying, as if my mouth had decided to negotiate without consulting my brain. "Done." And a real budget. No corners cut, no compromises on the quality of dancers or costumes or sets. Whatever you need. And if David tries to interfere, if he makes calls or threatens to pull funding or uses his influence to sabotage the project? Blake's expression hardened, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man who had built an empire through methods that were whispered about but never discussed openly. "David Wellington will not be a problem," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I can promise you that." The finality in his tone should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a fierce sense of liberation. For the first time in 3 years, someone was offering me protection, without asking for my freedom in return. "When would you need an answer?" I asked, though I already knew what my response would be. Blake's smile returned, transforming his face from intimidating to something approaching warmth. "You've already given me one," he said, then leaned down until his lips were nearly touching my ear. "Welcome back to the world, Brooke Bennett." The champagne reception following the ballet performance buzzed with excitement and speculation, but I found myself standing apart from the crowds, nursing a glass of Dom Pérignon, and watching Blake work the room with the fluid grace of a predator surveying his territory. He moved through conversations with practiced ease, shaking hands with politicians, nodding respectfully to judges, and exchanging pleasantries with business leaders who probably had no idea they were speaking to one of the most dangerous men in the city. It had been 2 weeks since that night at the Opera House, 2 weeks of phone calls and meetings and contract negotiations that had left my head spinning with possibilities. Blake hadn't been lying about his resources. The venue he was opening was spectacular, a converted warehouse in Tribeca that he was transforming into something between a nightclub and a performance hall. The budget he'd approved for my choreography project was more than I'd seen in 3 years of running my studio. "You look like you're plotting someone's demise," a voice said beside me, and I turned to find Sofia Martinez, a fellow dance instructor who had been one of the few people to maintain our friendship after my divorce. "Just thinking," I replied, accepting the second glass of champagne she offered. "This whole thing still feels surreal." Sophia followed my gaze to where Blake was deep in conversation with the mayor, his dark suit impeccable, despite the warmth of the crowded reception hall. "I have to admit, when you told me Blake Donovan was backing your return to choreography, I thought you'd finally snapped from the stress. You and everyone else." I took a sip of champagne, enjoying the way the bubbles tickled my throat. Even I'm not entirely convinced this isn't an elaborate hallucination. "What's he like?" Sophia asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I mean, really like? The rumors about him." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The rumors about Blake Donovan were legion and terrifying. Connections to organized crime, business rivals who had suffered mysterious accidents, federal investigations that had somehow evaporated without explanation. Most people in our social circle treated his name like a curse word, something to be whispered in private but never spoken aloud in polite company. I paused, trying to find words that would capture the complexity of the man I'd spent the past 2 weeks getting to know. "He's not what I expected." It was true, though inadequate. The Blake Donovan I'd been working with was nothing like the monster described in newspaper articles and gossip columns. He was intelligent, certainly, with a mind that moved through problems with surgical precision. He was demanding, expecting excellence from everyone around him, and expressing his displeasure when that standard wasn't met. But he was also surprisingly thoughtful, remembering details about my preferences and concerns that most people never bothered to notice. "That's reassuringly vague," Sophia said dryly. "Come on, Brooke. The man is basically a myth. What's he actually like to work with?" Before I could formulate an answer, I felt that familiar presence behind me. The way the air seemed to change when Blake entered a space, carrying with it the scent of expensive cologne, and something darker, more elemental. "Ladies." His voice was warm, but I caught the slight tension around his eyes that suggested he was less relaxed than he appeared. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." Sophia went slightly pale at finding herself face to face with Blake Donovan, but she managed to maintain her composure. "Mr. Donovan, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Sophia Martinez. I teach with Brooke at the studio." "Ah, the contemporary dance specialist." Blake's smile was genuine as he shook her hand. "Brooke speaks of your work very highly. I understand you've been instrumental in keeping the studio running during her transition period." The casual way he referenced details about my professional life made me wonder, not for the first time, exactly how thorough his investigation into my circumstances had been. It was flattering and unsettling in equal measure to be so completely seen by someone I barely knew. "I should probably circulate," Sophia said, clearly recognizing a dismissal when she heard one. "Brooke, we'll talk soon?" After she melted back into the crowd, Blake turned his full attention to me, and I felt that familiar flutter of awareness that his presence always triggered. Tonight he was dressed in a navy blue suit that had clearly been tailored to his exact measurements, and the subtle sheen of the fabric suggested it had cost more than most people's monthly salaries. "You seem distracted," he observed, his gray eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "I was thinking about the project," I said, which was partially true. "The timeline you're proposing is aggressive, 6 weeks from concept to performance. It's ambitious, even with unlimited resources." Blake's expression shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something harder beneath his polished exterior. "Is there a problem I should know about?" "No," I said quickly, then hesitated. "It's just, I keep waiting for the catch, for the moment when you explain what you really want in exchange for all this." His laugh was low and rich, but there was an edge to it that made me shiver. "Direct as always. I appreciate that about you, Brooke." He guided me toward a quieter corner of the reception hall, where tall windows overlooked the city lights and provided a modicum of privacy from the other guests. His hand on my elbow was light but possessive, a touch that somehow managed to be both protective and claiming. "You want to know what I expect in return," he said. And it wasn't a question. The thought had crossed my mind. I tried to keep my voice light, but I could hear the tension creeping in around the edges. "Men like you don't usually invest in failed ballet dancers out of the goodness of their hearts." Blake's eyes darkened at my self-deprecating description, and I realized I had struck a nerve. "Failed?" His voice was soft, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Is that how you see yourself?" "It's how everyone else sees me," I replied, gesturing vaguely toward the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. David made sure of that. The mention of my ex-husband's name caused Blake's jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly, and I was reminded that whatever David had done to sabotage my career, Blake was fully aware of it. The knowledge was both comforting and concerning. It was good to have someone in my corner, but it also raised questions about Blake's motives that I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. David Wellington is a small man who built his sense of worth by tearing down someone more talented than he could ever hope to be, Blake said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested he wasn't expressing an opinion so much as stating a fact. "The failure isn't yours, Brooke. It's his." The fierce conviction in his words sent warmth spreading through my chest, followed immediately by suspicion. I had learned the hard way that men who positioned themselves as my saviors often extracted a price that was higher than advertised. "That still doesn't answer my question," I pressed. "What do you want from me?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I want you to trust me," he said simply. "And I want you to stop looking over your shoulder, waiting for someone to take away everything you've worked for." The sincerity in his words caught me off guard, and I found myself studying his profile as he stared out at the city. There was something almost vulnerable about his expression, a crack in the armor of confidence he usually wore like a second skin. "Trust doesn't come easily to me anymore," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. "The last time I trusted someone completely, I ended up losing everything that mattered to me." Blake turned to face me fully, and the intensity in his gray eyes made my breath catch. "I'm not David Wellington," he said, and there was something almost fierce in his voice. "I don't break beautiful things just to prove I can." The compliment sent heat rushing to my cheeks, but it was the underlying promise in his words that made my heart race. This was dangerous territory. Allowing myself to trust a man whose reputation was built on violence and control, whose very presence at events like this sent seasoned politicians scrambling for cover. "You're asking me to take a leap of faith," I said quietly. "I'm asking you to let me prove that not every man with power uses it to hurt the people who depend on him," Blake replied. "Give me 6 weeks, Brooke. Let me show you what you're capable of when someone believes in your talent instead of trying to own it." The distinction between believing in me and owning me wasn't lost on me, and I wondered if Blake understood exactly how carefully he was navigating around the landmines of my past. But before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance of the reception hall caught our attention. David had arrived, Clarissa on his arm, both of them dressed to perfection, and wearing the kind of smiles that suggested they were prepared to work the room with surgical precision. I felt my stomach drop as I watched David's gaze sweep across the crowd, clearly searching for someone specific. "He's looking for you," Blake observed, his voice carefully neutral. "He's looking for a reaction," I corrected, watching as David's eyes finally found mine across the crowded room. "He wants to see if he can still get under my skin." Blake's hand settled on the small of my back, a warm, steadying presence that somehow made David's calculating stare feel less threatening. "Can he?" I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state as David began moving through the crowd in our direction. 3 weeks ago, the sight of him would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and panic. Tonight, with Blake's solid presence beside me and the promise of a real future stretching out ahead of me, David looked smaller somehow, less significant. "No," I said, and was surprised to realize I meant it. "I don't think he can anymore." Blake's smile was approval and something else, something that looked suspiciously like pride. "Good," he said softly, "because he's about to test that theory." David approached with the confidence of a man who had never met a room he couldn't dominate, Clarissa trailing slightly behind with the careful smile of someone who had learned to navigate her husband's moods with diplomatic precision. Up close, I could see the subtle signs of stress around David's eyes, the tension in his shoulders that suggested his life wasn't quite as perfect as he wanted everyone to believe. "Brooke." David's greeting was warm enough to fool casual observers, but I caught the sharp assessment in his eyes as they moved between Blake and me. "You're looking well. I heard through the grapevine that you're working on something new." The casual reference to my project with Blake was clearly intended to probe for information, and I realized that David's intelligence network was still functioning at full capacity. Somewhere in his web of contacts and favors, someone had reported back on my recent activities. "I am," I replied calmly, refusing to take the bait. It's exciting to be working on something substantial again. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm sure it is. Though, I have to say, I was surprised to hear you'd be collaborating with. He gestured vaguely toward Blake, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to say the name. With one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs? Blake's voice was pleasant, conversational, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made several nearby guests suddenly find reasons to move to other parts of the room. Of course, David's lawyer instincts kicked in, and he smoothly shifted tactics. I meant no disrespect. I simply worry about Brooke taking on projects that might be beyond her current scope. The implication was clear, that I was no longer capable of handling professional-level work, that my years away from the main stage had diminished my abilities to the point where I was likely to embarrass myself and anyone associated with me. It was a masterful piece of manipulation, designed to plant seeds of doubt in Blake's mind, while appearing to show concern for my well-being. Beyond her scope? Blake's repetition of David's words carried a dangerous edge that made my ex-husband's confident facade falter slightly. I'm curious what makes you think you're qualified to assess Brooke's professional capabilities. David's face flushed red, but he was too experienced a negotiator to let his temper show completely. I was married to her for 5 years, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I think I have some insight into her. Limitations. The word limitations hung in the air between us like a poison cloud, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that David's calculated cruelty always triggered. But before the old patterns of self-doubt could take hold, Blake's hand pressed more firmly against my back, a silent reminder of his presence and support. Were you? Blake's voice was soft, almost conversational, but something in his tone made Clarissa take an unconscious step backward. How interesting, because from where I stand, it looks like you spent 5 years trying to convince the extraordinary woman that she was ordinary, and when that didn't work, you decided to destroy her career out of spite. The accuracy of Blake's assessment hit David like a physical blow, and I saw something flicker in my ex-husband's eyes that might have been fear. Around us, the conversations of other guests had died away as people strained to hear what was clearly becoming more than a casual social exchange. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Clarissa interjected, her voice bright with the forced cheer of someone trying to diffuse a situation she didn't fully understand. David has always been supportive of Brooke's artistic pursuits. Blake's laugh was soft and utterly without humor. Has he? Is that why he made sure she couldn't get work with any major dance company in the city? Is that why every theater and arts organization mysteriously decided they had no need for her services? The public revelation of David's sabotage campaign sent a ripple of shock through the nearby guests, and I saw several society reporters discreetly pulling out their phones to record what was clearly about to become the scandal of the season. Those are serious accusations, David said, his lawyer's training finally kicking in as he recognized the legal minefield he was walking through. I hope you have proof to back up such claims. Blake's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Oh, I have proof, he said casually. Recorded phone calls, email exchanges, bank records showing payments to certain influential individuals. Quite a paper trail, actually. The color drained from David's face as he realized the extent of Blake's knowledge, and I understood that this confrontation had been orchestrated from the moment Blake decided to approach me at the opera house. He hadn't just been offering me an opportunity. He'd been preparing to destroy the man who had tried to destroy me. What do you want? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blake's expression shifted, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the man who had built an empire through methods that were whispered about in dark corners. This wasn't just about protecting me. This was about sending a message to anyone else who might think they could crush someone under Blake's protection. I want you to understand something very clearly, Blake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Brooke Bennett is under my protection now. Any attempt to interfere with her career, her well-being, or her happiness will be considered a personal insult that I will address accordingly. The threat was delivered with such calm politeness that it took several seconds for the full implications to sink in. When they did, David's face went completely white, and Clarissa looked between the two men with growing alarm. "Are you threatening me?" David managed, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "I'm clarifying the situation," Blake replied smoothly. "So there's no confusion going forward." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before David seemed to realize that he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the defeat of a man who had finally met someone with more power than he possessed. "I understand," he said quietly. "Excellent." Blake's smile returned, warm and charming, as if the previous conversation had been about the weather rather than the systematic destruction of a man's ability to harm me. "I'm so glad we could clear that up." David turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For a moment, he looked less like the controlling ex-husband who had haunted my nightmares, and more like the man I had fallen in love with a decade ago. Vulnerable, uncertain, almost lost. "For what it's worth, Brooke," he said softly, "I never meant for things to go as far as they did. I couldn't stand the thought of you being successful without me." The admission was probably the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from David, and I found myself feeling something that might have been pity for the man who had once controlled every aspect of my life. "I know," I replied, surprised by the gentleness in my own voice. "But that's your problem to solve, not mine." After David and Clarissa disappeared into the crowd, I realized that my hands were shaking and my heart was racing as if I'd just run a marathon. The confrontation I had been dreading for 3 years was over, and I was still standing, still whole, still protected by the man whose presence beside me had made me feel safer than I had in years. "Are you all right?" Blake asked, his voice soft with concern. I looked up at him, this dangerous, powerful man who had appeared in my life like an avenging angel, and felt something shift inside my chest. The walls I had built around my heart, the careful distance I had maintained from anyone who might have the power to hurt me, all of it was crumbling under the weight of his unexpected kindness. "I'm perfect," I said, and for the first time in 3 years, I actually meant it. The renovation of Blake's Tribeca venue had transformed what was once an industrial warehouse into something magical. Cathedral ceilings soared overhead, supported by exposed steel beams that had been painted matte black and fitted with sophisticated lighting systems. The original brick walls had been restored and softened with flowing fabric panels that could be repositioned to create intimate spaces or opened to reveal the full grandeur of the main performance area. I stood in the center of the empty space at 7 a.m, 3 weeks before our opening night, watching as early sunlight streamed through the massive windows and painted geometric patterns across the polished concrete floors. In my hands was a steaming cup of coffee from the espresso machine Blake had installed in what would eventually become the VIP lounge, and scattered around me were pages of choreographic notes, costume sketches, and technical specifications for the sound and lighting design. This was my sanctuary now, the place where I came to think and plan and remember who I used to be, before David convinced me I was less than I was. Every morning for the past month, I had arrived before the construction crews and cleaning staff, claiming these quiet hours as my own time to commune with the space and envision what we would create together. "You're here early again." Blake's voice carried across the empty space, and I turned to find him descending from the mezzanine level where his private office was located. He was dressed more casually than usual, dark jeans and a black sweater that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, but he still moved with that predatory grace that made him impossible to ignore. "I like the quiet," I replied, accepting the second cup of coffee he offered. "It's easier to think when there aren't 12 people asking me questions every 5 minutes. Blake's laugh was warm and rich, and I realized that I had grown to anticipate these moments, when his carefully controlled facade softened into something more genuine. Over the past month of working together, I had begun to see glimpses of the man beneath the reputation. Someone who was fiercely intelligent, unexpectedly thoughtful, and surprisingly vulnerable when he thought no one was watching. "The dancers arrive at 10, he said, settling beside me on the makeshift seating area where we often reviewed plans and discussed creative decisions. "Are you ready for them?" I nodded, though the familiar flutter of nerves in my stomach suggested I was less confident than I appeared. Today would be our first full rehearsal with the complete cast. 12 professional dancers I had hand-selected from auditions that had drawn talent from across the country. These weren't the eager children I usually taught, but accomplished artists who had performed with major companies and expected a level of professionalism I hadn't operated at in 3 years. "What if I've forgotten how to do this?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks. What if 3 years away from the professional world has made me irrelevant? Blake set down his coffee and turned to face me fully, his gray eyes serious and intent. "Do you remember the first time we met?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but I nodded. "The Opera House Gala. You asked me to dance." "Before that," he said softly. 3 months before that. You were teaching a class at your studio, advanced students, teenagers who were serious about dance but couldn't afford the elite academies. My breath caught in my throat. "You were watching me teach?" "I was considering making an investment in the building," Blake said, which I suspected was only partially true. "I wanted to see what kind of businesses were operating there, but when I saw you work with those kids..." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture I had learned indicated he was choosing his words carefully. "You transformed that converted warehouse into a cathedral, Brooke. You took children who had been told they weren't good enough for the prestigious schools and taught them to move like angels. You didn't just teach them technique. You taught them to believe in their own beauty, their own worth." The memory he was describing came flooding back. A particularly challenging class where I had been working with students who were struggling with confidence as much as coordination. I had pushed them harder that day than usual, demanding excellence while simultaneously building their faith in their own abilities. "That's when I knew," Blake continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "That's when I understood that David Wellington was the biggest fool in New York City, and that someone needed to give you the platform you deserved." The revelation that he had been watching me, planning his approach for months before that night at the Opera House, should have disturbed me. Instead, it sent a thrill of something dangerous and intoxicating through my veins. Blake Donovan, one of the most powerful men in the city, had spent months studying me, learning my patterns, planning the perfect moment to step into my life. "You orchestrated everything," I said, and it wasn't a question. "I created an opportunity," he corrected gently. "What you chose to do with it was entirely up to you." Before I could formulate a response, the sound of voices and footsteps echoed through the space as the construction crew arrived for their daily work. Blake stood smoothly, extending his hand to help me to my feet, and I felt the now familiar electricity that sparked whenever we touched. "Your dancers will be here soon," he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Show them what I saw that day in your studio, Brooke. Show them why I knew you were worth fighting for." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of introductions, warm-ups, and the delicate process of introducing 12 accomplished dancers to a choreographic vision that existed primarily in my head and scattered notebook pages. I had chosen each member of the company carefully, not just for their technical skills, but for their ability to embody the emotional complexity I wanted to explore in the piece. The theme I had settled on was transformation, the journey from confinement to freedom, from doubt to certainty, from surviving to thriving. It was deeply personal, drawn from my own experience of escaping David's control and rediscovering my artistic voice, but I had crafted it to speak to universal experiences of growth and change. The opening sequence is about weight, I explained to the dancers as we worked through the first movements. Not just physical weight, but emotional weight. The burden of other people's expectations, the heaviness of self-doubt, the way trauma can make even simple movements feel impossible. As I demonstrated the sequence, I felt muscle memory kicking in, the precise placement of feet, the controlled flow of arms, the way breath could be used to create lines and shapes that told a story without words. For the first time in years, I felt completely myself, completely at home in my own body. "Beautiful," murmured Elena Vasquez, my principal dancer, as she mirrored my movements with fluid grace. "This feels like therapy and art at the same time." The rehearsal continued until mid-afternoon, with breaks for notes, adjustments, and the kind of detailed technical work that separated professional dance from recreational movement. By the time I dismissed the company for the day, my body ached in ways I had forgotten were possible, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. How did it go? Blake appeared at my side as the last of the dancers filed out, and I realized he had been watching from the mezzanine level without my awareness. "Better than I hoped," I admitted, wiping sweat from my forehead with a towel. "They're incredible. Really incredible." I'd forgotten what it felt like to work with dancers who could keep up with my imagination. Blake's smile was soft and proud, and I felt warmth spreading through my chest at his obvious pleasure in my success. "You looked like you belonged up there," he said quietly. "Like you were exactly where you were meant to be." The compliment sent heat rushing to my cheeks, but it was the underlying promise in his words that made my heart race. Over the past month, I had begun to recognize the way Blake looked at me. Not just with desire, though that was certainly present, but with something deeper and more possessive. It was the look of a man who had found something precious and had no intention of letting it go. "I should get cleaned up," I said, suddenly self-conscious about my sweaty appearance and dance clothes. "And probably eat something substantial. I haven't had a real meal since yesterday." Blake's expression darkened slightly. "You haven't eaten since yesterday?" "I had coffee," I protested, but even as I said it, I realized how inadequate that sounded. "And some crackers around midnight." The disapproval in Blake's eyes was sharp and immediate, and I was reminded that beneath his polished exterior was a man who was accustomed to taking care of the people under his protection. "That's not acceptable, Brooke. You can't pour yourself into this project if you're not taking care of your basic needs." Before I could argue, he had his phone out and was speaking in rapid Italian to someone on the other end. I caught fragments, something about dinner, a private dining room, and very specific dietary requirements that suggested he had been paying attention to my eating habits more closely than I had realized. "What are you doing?" I asked when he ended the call. "Ensuring that you eat a proper meal," he replied, as if this was the most obvious thing in the world. "Franco is preparing dinner for us at Paradiso. We'll eat, discuss the progress of the project, and you'll remember that artistic brilliance requires proper fuel." The casual way he had rearranged both our evenings should have annoyed me, but instead I felt a flutter of anticipation at the prospect of spending time with Blake, away from the controlled environment of the venue. Over the past month, our interactions had been professional, productive, and surprisingly comfortable, but they had also been carefully bounded by the context of work. "I'm not exactly dressed for Paradiso," I pointed out, gesturing to my dance clothes and the fact that my hair was escaping from its ponytail in sweaty tendrils. Blake's gaze traveled over me slowly, and I felt my skin heat under his assessment. "You look perfect," he said, his voice carrying an undertone that made my pulse quicken. "Besides, Franco wouldn't dare turn away someone I'm dining with, regardless of what they're wearing." An hour later, I found myself in the private dining room of one of the city's most exclusive Italian restaurants, wearing the spare dress I kept in my office for emergencies, and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the obvious expense of the meal Blake had ordered. The The space was intimate and elegantly appointed, with soft lighting and a view of the kitchen where I could see the chef himself overseeing the preparation of our dishes. "This is incredible," I said, savoring a bite of the handmade pasta that had been prepared specifically for our meal. "I haven't eaten food like this since." I trailed off, realizing that the last time I had dined at a restaurant of this caliber had been during my marriage to David, when expensive meals and exclusive venues had been part of our regular routine. "Since your divorce," Blake finished softly, and I nodded, grateful that he understood without requiring explanation. "I don't miss the lifestyle," I said, which was mostly true. But I did miss feeling like I deserved beautiful things. Blake's expression grew serious, and he set down his wine glass to give me his full attention. "You deserve much more than beautiful things, Brooke. You deserve to be cherished, protected, celebrated for the extraordinary woman you are." The intensity in his voice made something flutter in my chest, and I found myself studying his face in the soft candlelight. "Blake, I know this is complicated," he continued, as if he could read the thoughts racing through my mind. "I know my reputation makes this situation problematic, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about trusting another powerful man with your heart." The acknowledgement of the elephant in the room should have provided relief, but instead, it sent anxiety spiraling through me. We were finally going to discuss what had been building between us for weeks. The attraction, the growing intimacy, the way he looked at me like I was something precious he intended to claim. "What are you asking me?" I said quietly. Blake reached across the table and covered my hand with his touch warm and steady and utterly familiar despite the relative newness of our relationship. "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that not every man who wants to protect you is trying to control you. I'm asking you to trust that I see your strength, not your vulnerability, as your most attractive quality." The distinction he was drawing between protection and control was one I had been grappling with for weeks. David had claimed to protect me too, but his protection had come with demands for compliance, for the suppression of parts of myself he found threatening or inconvenient. Blake's protection felt different, like a shield rather than a cage, something that enhanced my strength rather than containing it. "And what do you want in return?" I asked, because I had learned that powerful men always wanted something. Blake's smile was slow and predatory, sending heat pooling in my stomach. "I want you to let me take care of you," he said simply. "I want to watch you reclaim your place in the world and know that I helped make it possible. I want to fall asleep knowing you're safe and wake up planning new ways to make you smile." The romantic picture he painted was seductive and terrifying in equal measure, but it was the underlying possessiveness in his words that made my breath catch. This wasn't just about attraction or even love. This was about claiming, about making me his, in a way that would be recognized and respected by the dangerous world he inhabited. "That sounds like ownership," I said carefully. "It sounds like devotion," Blake corrected, his thumb tracing circles on my wrist. "There's a difference, though I understand why you might not see it clearly yet." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of our main course, but the tension between us remained, crackling like electricity in the intimate space. As we ate, Blake told me stories about the restaurant, about Franco's family history, and the way certain dishes connected to memories of his own childhood in Little Italy. The casual intimacy of sharing a meal, of learning details about his past, felt like stepping across a threshold I hadn't consciously chosen to cross. "My turn," I said, when he paused in his storytelling. "I want to know about the venue. Why that space specifically? And don't tell me it was just a good investment opportunity." Blake's expression grew thoughtful, and he took a sip of wine before responding. "My grandmother lived in that neighborhood when I was a child," he said finally. "The building where your studio is located used to be a community center, where she taught Italian cooking classes to immigrant families." The personal connection explained so much about his investment in the area, his knowledge of the local businesses, his decision to preserve certain architectural elements during the renovation. "She's gone now?" 5 years ago. Blake nodded. She never got to see me legitimize the family business, never saw me build something she could have been proud of. The venue is. I suppose it's my way of honoring her memory while creating something beautiful. The vulnerability in his admission made my chest tight with emotion, and I understood that I was seeing a part of Blake that few people ever glimpsed. Beneath the reputation and the power was a man who remembered where he came from, who carried the weight of family expectations and the desire to build something worthy of the people who had shaped him. She would be proud, I said softly, and watched as something shifted in his expression. Would she approve of you? He asked, and there was something almost uncertain in his voice. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the kind of woman who could raise a man like Blake, someone strong enough to survive in a dangerous world, but loving enough to instill values of loyalty and protection in her grandson. I think she would understand why you chose me, I said finally, and I think she would want you to be happy. Blake's smile was radiant, transforming his face from handsome to breathtaking. Then perhaps you'll let me introduce you to her someday, he said. And I realized he was talking about visiting her grave, about making me part of the most sacred rituals of his private life. The implication of that level of integration into his world should have terrified me, but instead I felt a settling sensation, as if pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving were finally clicking into place. Perhaps I will, I agreed, and watched as satisfaction and something deeper flickered in his gray eyes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of intimate conversation and shared laughter, the kind of easy companionship that suggested we had been moving toward this moment for much longer than the few months we had known each other. When Blake's driver arrived to take us home, I felt the familiar flutter of anticipation and anxiety that came with not knowing what would happen next. Your place or mine? Blake asked as we settled into the back seat of his car, and the casual way he posed the question suggested he had already made certain assumptions about how the evening would end. That's presumptuous, I said, though I made no move to create distance between us in the intimate space. Is it? His hand found mine in the darkness, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. Because I've been thinking about this moment for weeks, Brooke. About what it would be like to have you completely, without reservations or barriers between us. The honesty in his admission made heat pool in my stomach, and I realized that I had been thinking about it too, about what it would feel like to surrender to the attraction that had been building between us, to stop fighting the pull of his presence and see where it led. Your place, I heard myself saying, as if my mouth had made the decision without consulting my brain. But Blake, I need you to understand that this doesn't solve everything. I'm still figuring out how to trust again. His smile was gentle and patient, and when he lifted our joined hands to press a kiss to my knuckles, I felt something inside my chest crack open and let in the light. We have time, he said simply. All the time you need. Blake's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower in Midtown, and stepping into it felt like entering another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights, while the interior was a study in sophisticated minimalism, clean lines, rich textures, and carefully curated art that spoke to both wealth and refined taste. This is incredible, I breathed, moving toward the windows where the city spread out below us like a carpet of diamonds. I'm glad you approve, Blake said, his voice coming from behind me as he moved to a bar cart near the seating area. Would you like something to drink? I turned to find him pouring amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses, his movements economical and practiced. The soft lighting of the apartment cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the intensity of his gray eyes as they met mine across the space. Trying to get me drunk, Mr. Donovan? I asked, accepting the glass he offered. His laugh was low and rich. I don't need alcohol to get what I want from you, Brooke. I prefer my partners fully aware of every decision they're making. The casual reference to partnership sent heat spiraling through me, and I took a sip of the whiskey to buy myself time to process the implications of being here, alone with him, in the most private space of his life. The liquor burned pleasantly as it went down, warming me from the inside out. "Tell me about the art," I said, moving toward a painting that dominated one wall of the living area. It was abstract, but powerful. All swirling colors and bold strokes that suggested movement and passion. "Most of it belonged to my grandmother," Blake said, following me across the room. "She had excellent taste and a better eye for emerging talent than most gallery owners. That piece was painted by a street artist in Little Italy who couldn't afford canvas. She bought his work on wood scraps and old doors until he could establish himself properly." The story revealed another layer of the man I was slowly coming to understand. Someone who valued loyalty and potential over established reputation, who honored the people who had shaped him by preserving their legacies. It also explained the eclectic mix of pieces throughout the apartment, from classical sculptures to contemporary installations that would have looked at home in any major museum. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," I said, studying a smaller painting that showed the warmth and intimacy of family life in what looked like a modest kitchen. "She was the strongest person I've ever known," Blake replied, his voice soft with memory. "She survived things that would have broken most people and still managed to raise a family, build a community, create beauty wherever she went." I turned to face him, struck by the reverence in his voice when he spoke about his grandmother. "Is that what you're trying to do? Create beauty?" Blake's expression grew serious, and he moved closer. Close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I'm trying to build something worthy of the people who believed in me," he said quietly. "Including you." The inclusion of myself in his circle of important influences made my chest tight with emotion, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had become more than just a business investment or artistic project to him. I had become someone whose opinion mattered, whose approval he sought, whose happiness had become tied to his own sense of accomplishment. "Blake," I began, then found myself at a loss for words to express the complexity of what I was feeling. He seemed to understand without explanation, setting his glass aside and reaching for my hands with gentle certainty. "I know this is complicated," he said, echoing his words from dinner. "I know you have every reason to be careful, to protect yourself from men who claim to want to take care of you." "It's not just that," I admitted, allowing him to draw me closer. "It's that I'm afraid of losing myself again. With David, I became so focused on being what he wanted that I forgot who I was underneath all the performance." Blake's hands moved to frame my face, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones with devastating gentleness. "I don't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are," he said, his voice intense with conviction. I fell for the woman who fought to build her own studio when everyone else had written her off. I fell for the teacher who transforms children's lives one class at a time. I fell for the artist who creates magic out of movement and music. The word "fell" hung in the air between us, and I realized he was telling me he loved me without actually saying the words. The knowledge should have sent me running for the door, but instead, it filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the whiskey. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in my chest. "So am I," Blake replied, and the vulnerability in his voice made me look up at him in surprise. "Do you think this is easy for me? Letting someone matter this much? Caring about someone enough that their pain becomes mine?" The raw honesty in his words broke down the last of my resistance, and I found myself leaning into his touch, accepting the comfort and strength he was offering. "What happens now?" "Now," Blake said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You let me show you what it feels like to be cherished instead of controlled." When his lips met mine, it was with a gentleness that contradicted everything I thought I knew about powerful men and their appetites. This wasn't conquest or domination. but something closer to worship. A reverent exploration that made me feel precious rather than possessed. I melted into him, my hands finding the solid warmth of his chest as he deepened the kiss with careful intensity. Everything about the moment felt different from my previous experiences with men who saw relationships as battlegrounds to be won. Blake kissed me like I was something sacred he had been trusted to protect. "Bedroom?" he murmured against my lips, and I nodded, no longer capable of forming coherent words. Blake's bedroom continued the theme of sophisticated minimalism, dominated by a massive bed dressed in charcoal gray linens and flanked by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered the same spectacular city views as the living area. Soft lighting created an atmosphere of intimate luxury, and I felt a flutter of nervousness as the reality of what we were about to do settled over me. "Second thoughts?" Blake asked, his hands resting lightly on my waist as he studied my expression with concern. "Just overwhelmed," I admitted. "It's been a long time since I've been with someone I actually trusted." Blake's expression softened, and he pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said quietly. I meant what I said about having time. The patience in his offer only made me want him more, and I realized that his willingness to wait was exactly what made me feel safe enough to move forward. "I want this," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "I want you." What followed was a revelation in tenderness and passion combined. Blake undressed me with reverent care, his hands and mouth mapping every inch of revealed skin, as if he were memorizing me. When I reached for his clothes, he helped me with gentle guidance, never rushing, never demanding, always checking to make sure I was comfortable with each new development. When he finally settled over me, skin against skin, his gray eyes dark with desire and something deeper, I felt a completeness I hadn't known I was missing. This wasn't just physical release. It was emotional integration. The final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to solve since the night he first asked me to dance. "Mine," he whispered against my neck as we moved together in perfect synchronization, and for the first time in my adult life, the word didn't feel like a cage. It felt like coming home. Afterward, as we lay tangled in his expensive sheets with the city lights painting patterns across our skin, I felt a settling sensation in my chest, as if all the fractured pieces of my life had finally aligned into something coherent and beautiful. "No regrets?" Blake asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my bare shoulder. "None," I replied, and was surprised to realize I meant it completely. "Good," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "Because I have no intention of letting you go, Brooke Bennett. You're mine now, in every way that matters." The possessive declaration should have triggered every alarm bell in my head, but instead it filled me with a sense of security I hadn't felt since childhood. Being Blake's didn't mean losing myself. It meant finding the strength to become the fullest version of who I was meant to be. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, propping myself up on my elbow to study his face in the dim lighting. Blake's smile was soft and satisfied, like a man who had finally gotten something he'd been wanting for a very long time. "It means you don't have to worry about anything ever again," he said simply. "Your safety, your career, your happiness, all of it is my responsibility now." "That sounds like a lot of pressure," I observed, though I made no move to pull away from his embrace. "It sounds like purpose," Blake corrected, his arms tightening around me. "I've spent my entire adult life building power and influence without really understanding why. Now I know. It was all so I could protect what matters most to me." The conviction in his voice made something flutter in my chest, and I realized that I was looking at a man who had found his calling and taking care of me. It should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I love you," I said, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. Blake's expression transformed, and he rolled us over so he was looking down at me, his hands framing my face with infinite tenderness. "Say it again," he commanded softly. "I love you," I repeated, more confident this time. "I love your strength, your gentleness, the way you see possibilities where other people see problems. I love that you make me feel safe enough to be vulnerable and strong enough to be brave." Blake's kiss was deep and claiming, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with feeling. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. We made love again, slower this time, with the desperate edge of uncertainty, replaced by the languid exploration of two people who knew they had found something worth keeping. When exhaustion finally claimed us both, I fell asleep in Blake's arms, surrounded by luxury and protection, and the intoxicating certainty that I had finally found where I belonged. The last thing I remembered before sleep took me was Blake's voice, soft and possessive in the darkness. "Welcome home, beautiful. You're never leaving again." 3 months later, I stood backstage at Blake's venue, watching through the curtain gap as New York's elite filled the restored warehouse space for our opening night performance. The past 12 weeks had been a whirlwind of rehearsals, costume fittings, technical refinements, and media interviews that had positioned my return to choreography as one of the season's most anticipated cultural events. The transformation of both the space and my own life felt like something out of a fairy tale. Blake had spared no expense in creating a performance venue that rivaled anything in the city. State-of-the-art lighting and sound systems, luxurious VIP areas, and a stage that seemed to float above the audience like something from a dream. The main floor had been configured with intimate seating arrangements that allowed every guest to feel like they were experiencing the performance from the best seat in the house. 5 minutes to places, called our stage manager, and I felt the familiar flutter of pre-performance nerves mixed with an excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see Blake in the front row, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo, his attention focused entirely on the stage where I would soon appear. We had decided that I would perform the opening solo myself, a decision that had generated considerable buzz in the arts community. Brooke Bennett, former principal dancer with the Metropolitan Ballet, making her choreographic debut in a piece she would also perform. The critics were calling it either inspired or insane, depending on their perspective on my 3-year absence from the professional stage. "You look nervous," Elena observed, appearing at my side in her costume for the second piece. Over the months of rehearsal, she had become not just my principal dancer, but a trusted friend, someone who understood the pressure of returning to a world that had written you off. "Terrified," I admitted, smoothing down the flowing white fabric of my costume. The dress had been designed specifically for this piece. Layers of silk and chiffon that would catch the light and move like water as I danced. What if I've forgotten how to perform for an audience this size? Elena's smile was warm and confident. "Impossible. I've watched you in rehearsal. You don't just dance, you transform. The moment you step onto that stage, you become something magical." Her words provided the boost of confidence I needed, and I took a deep breath, centering myself the way I had learned to do before every performance in my previous career. The piece I had choreographed was deeply personal, the story of a woman breaking free from invisible chains, discovering her strength, learning to trust again. It was my story, but I had crafted it to speak to anyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "Places, everyone," the stage manager called again, and I moved toward my starting position, hidden behind a scrim that would lift to reveal me in the opening tableau. The lights dimmed, and I heard Blake's voice over the sound system as he welcomed the audience to what he called an evening of transformation and triumph. His words were brief but powerful, setting the stage for what we had created together. Then the music began, a haunting melody that built slowly, layer by layer, like hope emerging from despair. I had worked with the composer for weeks to create something that would support the emotional journey of the piece, while giving the dancers the rhythmic foundation they needed to tell the story through movement. The scrim lifted, and I was alone on the stage, bathed in a single spotlight that cast long shadows across the polished floor. For a moment, I felt the weight of every gaze in the audience, the pressure of expectations and the fear of failure threatening to freeze me in place. Then I began to move, and everything else fell away. The opening sequence was about confinement, small, constrained movements that suggested a woman trapped by invisible barriers. I had drawn from my own experience of feeling suffocated by David's control. The way his expectations had gradually reduced my world until I could barely breathe within the confines he had constructed. As the music swelled, my movements began to expand, reaching toward something just beyond my grasp. The lighting shifted from the harsh single spot to warmer, more diffuse illumination that suggested the possibility of dawn breaking through darkness. The first transformation came as other dancers joined me on stage, their presence initially oppressive, surrounding me with the weight of judgment and expectation. But gradually, through a series of intricate partnering sequences, they became sources of strength rather than limitation, lifting me higher than I could reach alone. I caught glimpses of the audience as I moved, their faces rapt with attention, completely absorbed in the story we were telling. In the front row, Blake's expression was one of fierce pride and something deeper, a possessive satisfaction that suggested he was watching something he had helped create. The centerpiece of the performance was a pas de deux between myself and Marcus, our male principal, that represented the delicate dance of learning to trust again after betrayal. The choreography required absolute faith in my partner's ability to catch me, support me, lift me safely through sequences that would be impossible to execute alone. As Marcus lifted me into a soaring arabesque that carried me high above the stage, I felt the metaphor come alive in my own body. This was what Blake had given me, not just the opportunity to dance again, but the security of knowing someone would always be there to catch me if I fell. The final sequence brought all 12 dancers together in a celebration of collective strength and individual freedom. The lighting opened up to reveal the full scope of the space, and the music built to a triumphant crescendo that left the audience breathless with the intensity of what they had witnessed. When the last notes faded and the final tableau held in perfect stillness, the silence that followed felt sacred. Then the applause began. Not polite appreciation, but the kind of thunderous ovation that shook the building and confirmed that we had created something truly special. As I took my bow, flowers raining down from the balcony level, I felt a completion I hadn't experienced since my days as a principal dancer. But this was different, better even, because it was mine, in a way my previous success had never been. Every movement, every musical phrase, every emotional beat had come from my own vision and experience. Blake was the first person to reach me as I came off stage, sweeping me into his arms with a kiss that was both celebration and claim. "Magnificent," he murmured against my lips. "Absolutely magnificent." The post-performance reception was a blur of congratulations, reviews being dictated into phones by critics who couldn't wait until morning to file their pieces, and champagne flowing as freely as the praise being heaped on our production. I moved through it all in a state of euphoric exhaustion, barely able to process the magnitude of what we had accomplished. The Times critic wants to schedule an interview for next week, Blake informed me as we stood together in a quieter corner of the reception area. And I've already had 3 calls from companies interested in commissioning new work. The prospect of future projects, of building a sustainable career rather than just achieving a single triumph, sent excitement spiraling through me. "This is really happening, isn't it?" I said, still hardly able to believe the transformation of my circumstances. "This is just the beginning," Blake replied, his arm tightening around my waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "You're going to rebuild your reputation, establish yourself as one of the city's premier choreographers, and never again have to worry about anyone having the power to diminish your light." The promise in his words was everything I had dreamed of during the dark years following my divorce. But it was the way he said "never again" that made me understand the full extent of his commitment to my protection. Blake didn't just want to see me succeed. He was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to ensure that no one could ever hurt me the way David had. Brooke, Brooke, the sound of my name being called with desperate urgency cut through the celebratory atmosphere, and I turned to see David pushing through the crowd toward us, his face flushed with alcohol and what looked like genuine distress. Clarissa was nowhere to be seen, and David's usual polished appearance was disheveled in a way that suggested his evening had not gone according to plan. Blake stepped slightly in front of me, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders squaring, stance widening, every line of his body radiating the kind of controlled menace that made smart people reconsider their actions. "Wellington," Blake's voice was perfectly polite and utterly cold. "I'm surprised to see you here." David's gaze flickered between Blake and me, and I could see him struggling with some internal debate. "I need to talk to Brooke," he said finally, his words slightly slurred. "Please, it's important." "Anything you need to say to my fiancé, you can say in front of me," Blake replied, and I felt a jolt of shock at his casual use of the word fiancé. David's eyes widened at the announcement, and I realized that our engagement, when had that been decided, was news to me as well as to him. But before I could process the implications of Blake's declaration, David was speaking again, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm sorry for everything I did to you, every way I tried to destroy your career, every lie I told about your abilities. You were always better than me. Better dancer, better person, better everything. And I couldn't stand it." The public apology was so unexpected that I felt tears pricking at my eyes. This was the David I had fallen in love with a decade ago, vulnerable and honest and capable of recognizing his own mistakes. It was also far too little, far too late. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, aware that every word was being observed by dozens of influential people. "But it doesn't change anything, David. The damage is done." "I know." David nodded miserably. "I know I can't undo what I did, but watching you tonight, seeing what you've accomplished, I needed you to know that I was wrong, about everything." Blake's hand settled on the small of my back, a gesture of support and a subtle reminder of his presence. "Your recognition of past mistakes is noted," he said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "Now I think it would be best if you left." David looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Blake's expression convinced him that further protest would be unwise. "Congratulations," he said to me, his voice hollow with defeat. "You deserve all of this and more." As David disappeared back into the crowd, I felt a strange sense of closure. The man who had once controlled every aspect of my life had been reduced to a pathetic figure seeking absolution for sins that couldn't be forgiven. His power over me was truly broken. "Fiancé?" I asked Blake quietly, raising an eyebrow at his presumptuous announcement. Blake's smile was unrepentant. "Would you prefer wife? Because I'm flexible on the timeline, but not on the outcome." The casual certainty with which he discussed our future should have alarmed me, but instead it sent warmth spreading through my chest. Over the past months, I had come to understand that Blake's possessiveness wasn't about controlling me. It was about claiming me, protecting me, making sure the world understood that I was under his protection. "Shouldn't you ask first?" I teased, though we both knew what my answer would be. Blake's expression grew serious, and he reached into his jacket pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. "Brooke Bennett," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the reception around us. "Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your own magnificence again?" The proposal was quintessentially Blake, direct, confident, and offering exactly what I needed most. Not just love, but protection. Not just partnership, but the security of knowing someone would always fight for my dreams. "Yes," I said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear and begin applauding. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring Blake slipped onto my finger was stunning. A vintage Art Deco design with a central diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light and scattered it like captured starlight. It was perfect, sophisticated without being ostentatious, and clearly chosen by someone who understood my taste better than I, sometimes understood it myself. As Blake kissed me amid the cheers and congratulations of the crowd, I felt the final piece of my new life clicking into place. I was no longer David Wellington's discarded ex-wife, or even just Brooke Bennett, the struggling dance teacher. I was Blake Donovan's fiancé, a successful choreographer in my own right, and a woman who had found her way back to her own power. The future stretched out ahead of us, filled with possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. More performances, new works to create, a wedding to plan, and the intoxicating promise of building a life with a man who saw my strength as something to be celebrated rather than contained. "So," Blake murmured against my ear as the reception continued around us. "Ready for the next act?" I looked around at the crowd of influential people celebrating our success, at the venue where my artistic vision had been brought to life, at the ring on my finger that marked me as belonging to one of the most powerful men in the city. 3 years ago, I had lost everything and thought my story was over. Tonight, I understood that it had only been the end of the prologue. "I'm ready for anything," I replied, and meant it completely. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Blake and I stood together on the empty stage where my artistic resurrection had taken place. The lights were dimmed but not extinguished, casting long shadows across the polished floor where I had poured out my heart and soul for an audience that had received it with open arms. "No regrets?" Blake asked, echoing the question he had posed on that first night in his apartment. I looked around at the space where my dreams had been reborn, thought about the ring on my finger and the man whose strength had become my own, considered the future we would build together in the dangerous, glittering world where power and art intersected. "None," I said, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like champagne and triumph, and the sweetest kind of surrender. In Blake's arms, surrounded by the remnants of my greatest professional achievement, I finally understood what it meant to be both protected and free, both claimed and autonomous, both surrendered and empowered. The dance of our love would be the most complex choreography I ever created, but also the most beautiful. After all, the best partnerships required absolute trust, perfect timing, and the willingness to let someone else lift you higher than you could reach alone. And as Blake carried me from the stage toward whatever came next, I knew I had found the perfect partner for the most important performance of my life.